The air in Washington during the spring of 1962 was thick, not just with the humidity of the Potomac, but with a palpable, suffocating tension. Inside the monolithic, five-sided fortress of the Pentagon, the atmosphere was even heavier. In the soundproofed conference rooms and the high-ceilinged offices of the nation's top military brass, a terrifying calculus was being performed. It was a scene that one might expect to find in the script of a dark, political thriller or a dystopian novel. Yet it was playing out in reality. The generals, men adorned with rows of ribbons and stars, were not discussing how to defend the American population from a foreign threat. Instead, they were coolly, rationally, and methodically discussing how many American lives could be sacrificed, how many citizens could be blown up, shot down, or terrorized to justify a war they were desperate to fight. It was a time when the boundaries between protection and persecution blurred in the shadow of the Iron Curtain. The men in these rooms, the highest-ranking officers in the United States military, had convinced themselves that the ends justified the most horrific of means. They sat around polished tables, papers shuffled between them, drafting a narrative written in blood American blood. This was not a rogue conversation among disgruntled subordinates. It was official business. On March 13, 1962, this chilling deliberation culminated in a physical document. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, JCS, the Supreme Military Council of the United States, formally presented a secret memorandum. It was a proposal that would remain hidden from the public eye for decades, a blueprint for state-sponsored terrorism, directed not at an enemy nation, but at the very people the military was sworn to protect. The objective was clear, brutal, and cynical: to manufacture a pretext for a military invasion of Cuba. To understand how such a monstrous proposal could reach the desk of the Secretary of Defense, one must understand the context of the era. It was the height of the Cold War. Paranoia was the currency of the realm in Washington. The geopolitical landscape had shifted violently in 1959 when Fidel Castro rose to power in Havana. The establishment of a communist regime just 90 miles off the coast of Florida was viewed not merely as a strategic setback, but as an intolerable existential threat. The fear of a Red Dawn in the Western Hemisphere drove the American military establishment to the brink of madness. The frustration was palpable. Traditional diplomacy and covert attempts to destabilize the Castro regime were failing. In the eyes of the Pentagon's leadership, drastic times called for unthinkable measures. The result of this paranoia was a dossier of deceit that defies belief. The document presented on that day in March was not a brief, vague suggestion. It was massive, exhaustive, and detailed. The full collection of documents related to this initiative eventually totaled 1,521 pages. It was a comprehensive encyclopedia of false flag operations actions designed to look like attacks by an enemy, but actually committed by the US government against its own assets and people. For 35 years, this stack of papers gathered dust in the deepest recesses of America's classified archives. It bore the heavy stamp of top secret, shielding its contents from journalists, historians, and the American public. While the 1960s roared with cultural revolution, the 1970s passed with Watergate, and the Cold War eventually thawed in the late 80s and early 90s. The truth about Operation Northwoods remained buried. It was a ghost story of the Cold War, a secret so dark that it took a specific government review board decades later to drag it into the light. When the documents were finally declassified, they revealed a shocking truth. The conspiracy theories that many had mocked were, in this specific instance, an understatement of reality. The plan had been real. The signatures were real. The intent to deceive the global community and traumatize the American public to trigger a war was official policy proposed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This section explores the genesis of that plan, setting the stage for one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of American governance. It is a story of how fear corrupted the highest levels of power, leading the guardians of the nation to plot a secret war against their own people. Caribbean Nightmare: How Cuba Became Enemy. To understand the genesis of Operation Northwoods, one must first step into the suffocating atmosphere of Washington, D.C. in the early 1960s. The capital was gripped by a singular, overwhelming obsession that bordered on hysteria. The source of this collective neurosis lay just beyond the turquoise waters of the Florida Keys. A mere 90 miles from American soil, the island of Cuba had transformed from a playground for American tourists and gangsters into the epicenter of the Red Scare. In the corridors of power, this proximity was terrifying. The artistic sketch of the era depicts a Washington consumed by paranoid hatred. The enemy was no longer across the ocean in Moscow or Berlin, but virtually on the American doorstep. The nightmare began in earnest in 1959. Fidel Castro's revolution swept away the Batista regime, and with it, decades of American influence. Washington watched with growing alarm as Castro not only established a communist foothold in the Western Hemisphere, but also aggressively moved against American interests. The nationalization of American companies and assets on the island was a slap in the face to the United States, signaling that Cuba was no longer a client state, but a defiant adversary. However, the political tension exploded into a full-blown crisis in April 1961. The Bay of Pigs invasion was intended to be the decisive blow that would topple Castro. Instead, it became a spectacular humiliation for the Central Intelligence Agency and the newly inaugurated Kennedy administration. The botched invasion, staffed by Cuban exiles and orchestrated by the CIA, collapsed under poor planning and a lack of direct American military support. The failure at the Bay of Pigs left deep scars on the American psyche, but nowhere were the wounds deeper than in the Pentagon. The interpretation among the top military brass was scathing. They viewed President John F. Kennedy as dangerously soft. In the eyes of the generals, the fiasco was the result of political hesitation and a lack of resolve. The military leadership believed that Kennedy's refusal to authorize open air support had doomed the operation, and they were determined never to let such a failure happen again. In the wake of this humiliation, the United States government launched Operation Mongoose. This was not a small, isolated project, but a sprawling covert program aimed at deposing the Castro regime. It brought together the heavy hitters of the American security apparatus, the CIA, the Department of Defense, and the State Department. Yet, despite the resources poured into sabotage and subversion, Castro remained firmly in power. The inability of covert means to dislodge the Cuban leader fueled the frustration within the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was this specific context, the embarrassment of April 1961, the perceived weakness of the president, and the stalling of Operation Mongoose, that set the stage for the extreme measures to come. The military concluded that covert, dirty tricks were not enough. They needed a war, a full-scale invasion to wash away the shame of the Bay of Pigs. But to get that war, they needed a reason that the American public and the world would accept. Cuba had become enemy number one, and in the minds of the Pentagon's architects, the destruction of this enemy was worth any price, even if the price was paid in truth. Architects of terror, who created Northwoods. The terrifying reality of Operation Northwoods lies not in the existence of a shadowy cabal of faceless conspirators, but in the prominence of the men who designed it. These were not rogue agents operating in a basement or marginalized extremists within the intelligence community. The architects of this terror were the most decorated, respected, and powerful military leaders in the United States. They wore the nation's highest uniforms, sat in its most prestigious offices, and operated with the full authority of the American government. At the apex of this hierarchy stood General Lyman Lemnitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. As the highest-ranking military officer in the country, Lemnitzer was the primary author and driving force behind the plan. He was a man of the establishment, a veteran of World War II and the Korean War. Yet in the climate of 1962, his worldview had hardened into a dangerous pragmatism. Lemnitzer was convinced that the United States was losing the Cold War to communism, and that the civilian leadership lacked the stomach to do what was necessary. It was under his direct supervision that the Joint Chiefs of Staff pivoted from defense to the manufacturing of aggression. While Lemnitzer provided the authority, the specific intellectual genesis of the plan's darkest elements can be traced to Brigadier General William Craig. On February 2, 1962, it was Craig who authored a pivotal memorandum that laid the groundwork for what would become Northwoods. In this document, Craig first articulated the concept of creating a pretext that would provide the justification for U.S. military intervention in Cuba. His initial ideas planted the seeds that would grow into the elaborate scenarios of false flag terrorism. He was the technician of the operation, translating the desire for war into a bureaucratic proposal for manufactured tragedy. The intended recipient of this proposal was Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense. The plan was not kept from the civilian leadership of the Pentagon. Rather, it was prepared specifically for McNamara's eyes, intended to be signed and approved as a legitimate course of action. The generals believed that if they could present a logical path to war, even one paved with lies, the Secretary of Defense would see the strategic necessity of their vision. A crucial, often overlooked fact about Operation Northwoods is that it was not developed in a vacuum. It was created within the framework of an official interagency program. This was not a secret cell acting against orders. The development of these false flag operations was part of the recognized workflow of the Cuba project. The machinery of the U.S. government was functioning exactly as it was designed to, processing requests and generating solutions. In this case, however, the solution proposed by the military establishment was treason against the truth. The interpretation of these events is chilling. Operation Northwoods was not a conspiracy of marginal figures. It was an official, unanimous proposal from the highest military leadership of the country. These men, Lemnitzer, Craig, and their colleagues on the Joint Chiefs, viewed themselves not as villains, but as patriots willing to dirty their hands. They sat in their air-conditioned offices and drafted plans to kill Americans, believing that the deception was a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of defeating communism. They were the architects of terror, and they built their blueprints on government stationery. Menu of terror. What exactly? The Pentagon proposed. To read the specific proposals contained within the Northwoods dossier is to step into a realm of cold-blooded calculation that defies the imagination. The document reads less like a strategic defense paper and more like the screenplay for a high-stakes disaster movie. Yet it was not written by Hollywood screenwriters. It was a real military plan, drafted with bureaucratic precision, offering a menu of manufactured tragedies designed to manipulate the American public into demanding war. The scope of the proposed violence was terrifyingly domestic. The Joint Chiefs did not limit their imagination to military targets. They brought the war home. The plan explicitly suggested a campaign of terror within the United States itself. The generals proposed detonating bombs in Miami and other Florida cities, and even in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. They were fully prepared to inflict casualties among their own civilian population, believing that the sight of Americans bleeding on American soil was the fastest route to an invasion of Havana. One of the most opportunistic and disturbing ideas involved the American space program. In a proposal labeled as a dirty trick, the military looked at the upcoming orbital flight of John Glenn, the first American to orbit the Earth. The plan suggested that if the mission were to fail and the rocket were to explode, the United States could manufacture evidence proving that Cuban electronic interference was responsible. They were ready to use the death of a national hero as a propaganda tool to frame a foreign government. The architects of Northwoods also looked to history for inspiration, specifically the event that triggered the Spanish-American War. They proposed a modern reenactment of the USS Maine incident of 1898. The plan outlined blowing up a US ship in the harbor of Guantanamo Bay. The destruction would be blamed on the Cubans, providing a powerful, historically resonant casus belli. The document coolly discussed the sinking of a vessel and the likely loss of naval personnel as acceptable collateral damage for the strategic objective. However, the most elaborate and cynical scenario in the dossier involved a civilian airliner. The Pentagon devised a complex plan to simulate the shooting down of a charter flight. An unmanned drone, painted to look exactly like a commercial aircraft, would be substituted for a real plane mid-air. The real plane, loaded with federal agents using aliases, would drop to a low altitude and land at a secret auxiliary field at Eglin Air Force Base. Meanwhile, the drone would continue on the flight path, broadcasting distress signals indicating an attack by Cuban MiGs before being detonated by a radio signal. The world would be told that Castro had murdered a plane full of American college students on a holiday trip. The level of detail in this deception was meticulous. A little-known fact revealed in the documents is that the military planned for the aftermath as well. They prepared to hold funerals for mock victims, complete with full ceremonies, grieving families, and obituaries, to sell the lie to the press and the public. They were creating a complete alternate reality of grief. Finally, the plan included direct incitement at the Guantanamo naval base. The Joint Chiefs proposed bribing subordinate Cuban commanders to launch a real attack on the base, effectively paying the enemy to start the war that the Pentagon so desperately wanted. Every scenario in the menu of terror shared a common theme: the absolute weaponization of deception, where the truth was the first casualty and American citizens were treated as pawns in a geopolitical game. March 16th, 1962, the day Kennedy said no. On March 16th, 1962, the trajectory of American history arrived at a quiet but decisive crossroads within the walls of the White House. It was the day the unstoppable force of the military-industrial complex collided with the immovable object of the president's conscience. The meeting scheduled for that afternoon was intended by the Pentagon to be the final seal of approval on their grand design for war. Instead, it became the moment the plan died on the president's desk. President John F. Kennedy sat across from General Lyman Lemnitzer and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The atmosphere was charged with the unspoken friction that had been building since the Bay of Pigs. When the concepts underpinning Operation Northwoods were brought to the fore, Kennedy did not waver. The fact is recorded clearly in history. On that day, the president formally rejected the plan. His refusal was not merely a tactical disagreement. It was a fundamental moral and strategic repudiation of the military's approach. Kennedy made his position explicitly clear. He stated that he would not discuss the use of U.S. military force against Cuba in such a manner. For the president, the idea of manufacturing a war through deception was anathema to the democratic principles he publicly championed. He was looking for a solution to the Cuban problem, but he drew a sharp line at acts of terror against his own constituency or the staging of fraudulent attacks to fool the world. General Lemnitzer, however, was not a man easily deterred. Even in the face of the president's skepticism, he attempted to salvage the initiative. Lemnitzer reportedly emphasized that the military had plans for creating plausible pretexts to justify intervention. He spoke the language of the Cold War hawk, believing that if the president simply understood how convincing the lies could be, he would agree to the strategy. But Lemnitzer had misread his commander-in-chief. Kennedy remained adamant. The president's no was final, effectively shutting down the operational implementation of the Northwoods proposals. The consequences of this meeting were profound and far-reaching. The rejection of Operation Northwoods marked the point of no return in the deteriorating relationship between the Kennedy administration and the military establishment. Kennedy, already skeptical of the CIA and the Pentagon after the disasters of 1961, now viewed his top generals with deep suspicion. He realized that the men in charge of the nation's defense were willing to go to extremes that he found politically and morally repugnant. This breach of trust had tangible career consequences for General Lemnitzer. Although he was not publicly reprimanded, an act that would have revealed the scandalous nature of the proposal, his days at the helm of the U.S. military were numbered. Kennedy declined to nominate Lemnitzer for a second term as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Instead, in 1963, the general was effectively exiled from Washington. He was sent to Europe to serve as the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO forces, a prestigious position, but one that removed him from the immediate levers of power regarding Cuba and domestic policy. The interpretation of this event suggests a deepening fracture within the U.S. government. The decision to reject Northwoods solidified the view among the military elite that Kennedy was an obstacle to American security. Conversely, it proved that the system of civilian control over the military, though strained, was still functioning. However, the shadow of this refusal stretches long into history. In the decades since, conspiracy theorists and historians alike have speculated on the darker implications of March 16, 1962. A persistent rumor suggests a link between Kennedy's refusal to authorize these false flag operations and his assassination in Dallas in November 1963. While no definitive evidence proves a connection, the timeline is haunting. The president who stopped the military from waging a secret war was killed just over a year later, leaving behind a legacy of what-ifs and a military establishment that felt he had tied their hands in the face of the enemy. The plan that did not die. Continuation. After refusal. It is a common assumption in the history of democratic governance that when a head of state issues a direct refusal to a specific course of action, the matter is closed. However, the saga of Operation Northwoods reveals a disturbing counter-narrative regarding the nature of power within the American military establishment of the early 1960s. President John F. Kennedy's firm rejection of the false flag proposals on March 16, 1962, should have been the end of the story. Yet, the historical record demonstrates that the plan did not die that afternoon in the Oval Office. Instead, it mutated. The architects of the plan were driven by an ideological conviction so deep that even the president's no was viewed not as a moral prohibition, but merely as a bureaucratic obstacle to be circumvented. The fact remains, documented in the archives of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, JCS, that the military leadership continued to propose similar ideas for provocations well into 1963. The obsession with invading Cuba had become a fixed point in the Pentagon's strategic universe, and the generals were relentless in their pursuit of a trigger. Having been denied the authorization to stage attacks against American targets, they shifted their creative, albeit destructive, energies toward international scenarios. If the president would not sacrifice American citizens to justify a war, perhaps he would be moved by attacks on the allies of the United States. In the months following the rejection, the Joint Chiefs devised new, elaborate schemes designed to widen the conflict. One of the most cynical of these revised plans involved the Caribbean nations of Jamaica and Trinidad-Tobago. These territories were members of the British Commonwealth, and an attack on them would be an attack on the interests of the United Kingdom. The Pentagon strategists proposed a series of staged, covert operations that would simulate Cuban aggression against these islands. The logic was cold and calculating. By staging a Cuban attack on Jamaica or Trinidad, the United States could force the hand of Great Britain. The goal was to entrap the British government, compelling them to declare war on Castro, or, at the very least, to request American military assistance. Such a request would provide the United States with the multilateral cover it needed to launch a full-scale invasion, bypassing Kennedy's reluctance to act unilaterally based on a fabricated domestic attack. This persistence highlights a profound interpretation of the era. The military leadership had effectively gone rogue in their intellectual planning. They refused to resign themselves to the rejection of their war. They were actively seeking new pathways to conflict, willing to manipulate international relations and endanger the stability of the entire region to achieve their objective of regime change in Havana. The momentum of these secret plottings was only temporarily disrupted by the terrifying reality of October 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of actual nuclear annihilation, shifting the focus from manufactured pretexts to genuine existential survival. For 13 days, The theoretical war games of the Pentagon were replaced by the very real possibility of global destruction. However, even during this crisis, the tension between Kennedy and his generals intensified rather than dissipated, while the president sought a diplomatic resolution through a naval blockade and back-channel negotiations. Many in the military leadership, including the architects of Northwoods, pushed aggressively for immediate airstrikes and an invasion. They saw the presence of Soviet missiles not just as a threat, but as the ultimate validation of their desire for war, the opportunity they had been waiting for. When the crisis ended without an invasion, the frustration within the Pentagon deepened. The peaceful resolution was viewed by some hardliners as another missed opportunity. The military had not made peace with the idea of coexistence with a communist Cuba, even after staring into the abyss of nuclear war. The institutional machinery of the Joint Chiefs continued to churn. They did not abandon their objectives. They merely retreated to the shadows to wait for the next opportunity. The survival of these aggressive concepts after a direct presidential veto serves as a chilling testament to the autonomy of the military-industrial complex during the Cold War. It demonstrated that in the minds of the generals, the war against Cuba was inevitable, and the search for a pretext, real or imagined, was a duty that superseded the political will of the civilian administration. Years of silence. How the plan remained a secret. For more than 3 decades, the blueprint for Operation Northwoods did not exist in the public consciousness. It vanished into the vast, labyrinthine nervous system of the American national security state. From the moment the documents were filed away in 1962 until their re-emergence in 1997, the plan to wage war against American citizens remained buried under the highest classification seal available, top secret. The silence surrounding this operation is perhaps as chilling as the plan itself. During those 35 years, the United States underwent profound transformations. The country survived the assassination of a president, the turmoil of the Vietnam War, the constitutional crisis of Watergate, and the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. Yet, through all these upheavals, the dossier remained secure, the lock held. The institutional memory of the Pentagon proved to be a fortress that no journalist or historian could breach. It is a remarkable fact of history that not a single participant involved in the creation or review of Operation Northwoods revealed the information publicly during their lifetime. Dozens of high-ranking officers, aides, and secretaries handled these papers. They sat in the meetings where the bombing of Miami and the sinking of American ships were discussed with dry, bureaucratic detachment. Many of these men went on to write memoirs, give extensive interviews about their service, and retire with honors. Yet a code of omerta prevailed. Whether out of a sense of twisted patriotism, fear of prosecution, or a desire to protect the reputation of the military, they took the secret to their graves. The discipline of the Joint Chiefs of Staff ensured that the truth was hermetically sealed. The artistic sketch of this era of silence is one of mundane horror. For decades, the 1,521 pages of the Northwoods documents sat in cardboard boxes or filing cabinets within the deeper archives of the government. One can imagine the scene: fluorescent lights humming over rows of metal shelves in a secure facility. Government employees, clerks, and archivists walked past these files every day, carrying coffee, discussing sports or politics, completely oblivious to the radioactive nature of the papers sitting inches away from them. The documents were hidden in plain sight, lost in the ocean of classified material that the Cold War produced, waiting like a dormant virus. This long period of secrecy forces a reassessment of how we view government conspiracies. The interpretation here is stark. The system of secrecy was far more effective than even the most paranoid conspiracy theorists could have imagined. While the public often believes that someone always talks and that large-scale secrets cannot be kept, Operation Northwoods proves otherwise. It demonstrates that the American government possessed the capability to completely suppress evidence of its own willingness to commit treason against its people. The machinery of classification worked perfectly. It protected the architects of terror from accountability and shielded the American public from the horrifying realization that, for a brief moment in 1962, their greatest threat came not from Moscow or Havana, but from the Pentagon itself. Declassification. How the world learned. About Northwoods. The wall of secrecy that had surrounded Operation Northwoods for 35 years did not crumble due to a dramatic leak by a whistleblower or the investigative tenacity of the press. Instead, the truth emerged through the slow, grinding gears of government bureaucracy. It is one of history's great ironies that the plot to undermine the presidency of John F. Kennedy was revealed only because of the relentless public fascination with his death. The process began on November 18, 1997. The John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Review Board, a body established by Congress to oversee the release of classified files related to the president's murder, made a stunning decision. In their search for any document that could shed light on the climate of 1963, they declassified a massive cache of papers totaling 1,521 pages. Buried within this mountain of administrative records were the justification for U.S. military intervention in Cuba. For the first time, the text of Operation Northwoods was technically available to the public. However, the sheer volume of the release meant that its explosive contents were not immediately digested by the world at large. The information began to seep into the public consciousness a year later. On November 6, 1998, the National Security Archive, a non-governmental research institute based at George Washington University, published significant excerpts of the plan in collaboration with CNN. This was the first time the mainstream media began to grapple with the reality that the Joint Chiefs of Staff had authorized a plan to terrorize Americans. Yet, even then, the story remained largely a niche interest, discussed primarily by historians of the Cold War and intelligence analysts. The true explosion of public awareness occurred on April 30, 2001, with the full publication of the documents online, coinciding with the release of a seminal book. James Bamford, an investigative journalist and expert on the National Security Agency, published Body of Secrets. In this detailed history of American intelligence, Bamford dedicated a chapter to Operation Northwoods, translating the dry military jargon of the documents into a narrative that shocked the conscience of the nation. Bamford's book popularized the story, moving it from the dusty shelves of archives to the bedside tables of the American public. He laid bare the cynicism of the generals, presenting the documents not just as a historical footnote, but as a terrifying revelation of the mindset of the military-industrial complex. The reaction to these revelations rippled beyond the borders of the United States. In Cuba, the declassification was met with a sense of grim vindication. For decades, the Castro government had claimed that the US was plotting false flag operations, claims that were often dismissed in the West as communist propaganda. In 2001, following the widespread publication of the Northwoods files, the Cuban government issued an official condemnation of the plan. For Havana, the documents were irrefutable proof that their paranoia regarding their northern neighbor had been entirely justified. A little-known but crucial fact about this saga is the accidental nature of the discovery. Operation Northwoods was not exposed because a brave journalist dug it up. It was exposed solely because of the JFK Records Act of 1992. If the review board had not been mandated to release every document even tangentially related to Kennedy's administration in the hopes of solving his assassination, these plans might still be classified today. The world learned about the secret war not through a triumph of transparency, but as a byproduct of a nation trying to understand its greatest tragedy. Echo of Northwoods, conspiracy theories, and political speculations. The declassification of Operation Northwoods did not merely correct the historical record. It unleashed a shockwave that continues to reverberate through modern American culture. Once the documents were released from the quiet confinement of the National Archives, they ceased to be mere bureaucratic artifacts of the Cold War. In the age of the Internet and eroding trust in institutions, Operation Northwoods was weaponized. It became the ultimate ammunition for skeptics, the smoking gun that transformed fringe paranoia into plausible suspicion. The most significant and persistent echo of this operation is found in the shadow of the September 11th attacks. For the community of conspiracy theorists known as the 9/11 Truth Movement, the Northwoods dossier serves as a foundational text, a kind of dark scripture. When the Twin Towers fell and the official narrative of a surprise terrorist attack was established, skeptics pointed to 1962 as a precedent. The logic was seductive in its simplicity. If the Joint Chiefs of Staff were willing to hijack planes, blow up buildings, and kill American citizens to start a war in Cuba, why would the government not do the same to justify wars in the Middle East? The specific detail in the Northwoods plan about swapping a commercial airliner for a drone became a central pillar in theories claiming that the planes which hit the World Trade Center were remote-controlled military assets. For millions of people, Northwoods provided the psychological bridge to believe the unthinkable, that the US government is capable of being the architect of its own nation's tragedy. This narrative has moved beyond anonymous internet forums and into the arena of high-profile politics. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the nephew of the president who rejected the plan, has frequently utilized Operation Northwoods in his political rhetoric. He cites the operation as definitive proof of the malevolence of the American intelligence and military apparatus. However, there is a strategic omission in this usage. While he correctly highlights the monstrosity of the proposal, the political narrative often downplays or ignores the critical conclusion. His uncle said no. By focusing on the intent of the generals rather than the refusal of the president, the operation is used to paint a picture of a government that is wholly irredeemable, rather than one where civilian leadership can, and did, stand against military excess. The interpretation of this phenomenon reveals a profound shift in the American psyche. Operation Northwoods has become the enduring symbol of the deep state, It validates the fear that within the legitimate government, there exists a shadow government operating without moral compass or legal restraint. It has permanently damaged the credibility of official denials. Whenever a controversial event occurs, be it a mass shooting or a chemical attack overseas, the word Northwoods is invoked as shorthand for state-sponsored deception. However, there is a distinct conflict between the rumor and the historical fact. Conspiracy theorists view Northwoods as proof of an omnipotent, evil cabal. Yet, the historical reality suggests the opposite. The very fact that the plan was proposed and then summarily rejected by the civilian leadership disproves the theory of an all-powerful military-industrial complex. The system of checks and balances, though strained, functioned exactly as intended. The military proposed, and the democratically elected president disposed. The rejection of the plan is evidence that the US government was not a monolith of evil, but a battlefield of competing moralities where, in this specific instance, restraint triumphed over aggression. Nevertheless, the artistic sketch of the modern era is dominated by the digital afterlife of the document. In the glow of computer screens, on Reddit threads, 4chan boards, and YouTube comment sections, Operation Northwoods is discussed with obsessive fervor. It is cited in arguments as the ultimate trump card, the undeniable proof that they are out to get us. The document that was written on typewriters in 1962 has been digitized into a meme of distrust, ensuring that the ghost of General Lemnitz's plan haunts the American consciousness far more effectively than it ever haunted Fidel Castro. Lessons of history. What Northwoods says about power and democracy. The legacy of Operation Northwoods offers a complex and unsettling reflection on the nature of American governance. It presents a profound paradox that lies at the heart of the democratic experiment. On one hand, the system of checks and balances, the bedrock of the US Constitution, functioned precisely as designed. The military establishment proposed a course of action, and the civilian head of state, President Kennedy, exercised his authority to reject it. In this light, the story is a triumph of civilian control over the military, proving that the moral compass of an elected leader can withstand the pressure of the war machine. However, relief at the plan's rejection cannot obscure the terrifying reality of its creation. The mere fact that such a plan was conceived, drafted, and approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff reveals a dark truth about the nature of state power. It demonstrates that the highest levels of the military leadership were psychologically and operationally prepared to employ extreme measures against their own population. The men sworn to defend the Constitution were willing to suspend the rights and safety of the citizenry to achieve a geopolitical objective. This was not a theoretical exercise. It was a testament to how easily the line between protection and sacrifice can be blurred when the state becomes obsessed with an enemy. This realization leads to a haunting question that remains unanswered to this day. What else is there? Operation Northwoods was only brought to light due to the unique circumstances surrounding the investigation into President Kennedy's assassination. It was a needle found in a haystack because specific searchlights were turned on. This raises the disturbing possibility of the unknown. How many similar plans were drafted, discussed, and perhaps even executed, but never declassified? How many other Northwoods scenarios remain buried under the stamp of national security, protected by the silence of those who have long since passed away. A little known and deeply troubling fact adds to this unease. In the wake of Operation Northwoods, despite the internal rejection by the president, there were no structural changes made to the US military code or federal law. No new legislation was passed to explicitly criminalize the proposal of false flag operations against American citizens. The system did not recoil in horror and build new guardrails. It simply filed the plan away and moved on. The bureaucratic machinery that produced the plan remained intact, implying that the proposal was viewed not as a crime, but merely as a rejected option. Therefore, the interpretation of these events must be clear. Operation Northwoods was not an anomaly or a glitch in the system. Rather, it is a window into the backstage kitchen of Cold War decision-making. It reveals a mindset where morality is subordinate to strategy and where truth is a flexible asset. It strips away the veneer of noble intent, often associated with American foreign policy of the era, exposing the raw, cynical mechanics of power. The artistic sketch of this lesson takes us back to the physical reality of secrets. Somewhere in the vast subterranean archives of the Pentagon or the secure storage facilities of the CIA, there are miles of shelves stacked with manila folders. They are filled with yellowing paper, typed memos, and contingency plans. As we walk past them in our imagination, we must acknowledge that Operation Northwoods is likely just one file among thousands. It reminds us that the history we know is only the history that has been allowed to survive the shredder, and that the true extent of what the government has planned for its people may never be fully known. Conclusion. Is the threat alive today? The declassified dossier of Operation Northwoods sits in the archives of history, not merely as a relic of the Cold War, but as a living, breathing warning. While the specific men who sat around the mahogany tables of the Pentagon in 1962 are long gone, and the Soviet Union they feared has dissolved, the fundamental question raised by their actions remains urgently relevant. Is the threat of such betrayal still alive today? To answer this, one must look beyond the specific tactics of blowing up ships or hijacking planes. The methods of warfare and deception have evolved, but the underlying philosophy of the false flag has not disappeared. It has merely adapted to the digital age. Today, we do not see crude proposals for physical sabotage as often as we see sophisticated information operations. The modern equivalent of Operation Northwoods is not necessarily a bomb in a city square, but a disinformation campaign designed to manipulate public perception, manufacture consent for conflict, or destabilize a society from within. The drones of General Lemnitz's plan have been replaced by bot farms, deepfake technology, and cyber warfare. The objective remains the same: to create a false reality that compels the public to support a state agenda they would otherwise reject. The most lasting damage inflicted by the revelation of Operation Northwoods is the erosion of trust. Once a citizen reads the document and realizes that their own government was willing to kill innocent people for a geopolitical gambit, the relationship between the state and the individual is permanently altered. It casts a long, dark shadow over every official explanation of a crisis. When a chemical attack occurs in a war zone, or a terrorist incident strikes a Western capital, the knowledge of Northwoods whispers a nagging doubt. Is this real? Or is this another script? This skepticism is the toxic legacy of the operation. It has made the public understandably wary of official versions, creating a crisis of credibility that fuels the very conspiracy theories the government seeks to combat. Furthermore, Operation Northwoods forces a confrontation with the eternal balancing act between national security and civil rights. The generals in 1962 believed they were patriots. They justified their monstrous plan with the conviction that the survival of the nation against communism was worth any price. This dangerous utilitarianism, the idea that the government can suspend the rights and lives of its citizens to save the country, is a debate that continues to rage in the era of mass surveillance and the war on terror. The logic that birthed Northwoods is the same logic that justifies warrantless wiretapping and indefinite detention. It serves as a stark reminder that the greatest threat to liberty often comes from those who claim to be its ultimate protectors. Ultimately, the story of Operation Northwoods is a testament to the fragility of democracy. The plan was stopped not by a law or a court or a public outcry, but by the conscience of a single-man president, John F. Kennedy. We cannot always rely on the presence of such a leader to stand between the military apparatus and the people. The final thought that this history leaves us with is a solemn one. Operation Northwoods teaches us that blind faith in government is a luxury a free people cannot afford. The documents, now available for all to see, serve as a permanent monument to the necessity of skepticism. As we navigate a world of increasing complexity and covert conflict, the lesson of 1962 rings louder than ever. Eternal vigilance is not just a slogan, it is the absolute price of liberty. The plans may be locked away, but the impulse to use power without restraint is a ghost that never truly sleeps.